Hi, all. Uh, Here I am again. I'm so sorry that you continue to have to learn about history through a recorded lecture. But for those of you who like the recorded lectures, I hope that you are enjoying this. I am hopefully going to be back by Wednesday. I'm praying I can come back tomorrow, but as of right now, I think I'll be back definitely on Wednesday. So I'm going to do today's lecture online. For the do now, I'm hoping that you are able to do the do now as a class. If you are not able to do the do now as a class, I'm going to ask that you answer questions 1 and 2 in your notebooks now. As I said in the directions, you can take regular notes. That's fine with me, so long as I can check them and I can read them when I get back. And also, if you would prefer to do sketch notes, I always encourage you to do those, as I think those require a higher level of thinking because they cause you or they encourage you to pause and stop and think about what you're writing. All right, so let's go into full screen mode. And I apologize for the stuffiness over here. So, again, for the do now, if you didn't do this in class, I would like you to answer this in your notebooks. This idea of strength is something that we will be thinking about throughout the course of the week, specifically as we go into some pretty difficult topics. So, our agenda for today is a do now. I'm going to do a mini lecture, and then you're actually going to watch a video and work in partners to listen to some testimonies. And I'll get to that at the end of class. Hoping you get through those testimonies today. If not, I'll give you time tomorrow to finish them. The sub will let me know. Okay, so this week we're switching gears and we're moving away from the European theater and we're moving into the Pacific. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry, had to blow my nose, and we're back. Okay, so this week we will be switching gears and we'll be moving into the Pacific, meaning we're going to be looking specifically at Japan and China. And we're going to be looking less at battles and more at the experience of civilians during the war. So I wanted to let you know that this week is going to be challenging. There's a lot of material that we'll be learning that is both sensitive and potentially triggering. We do believe it is important to be informed about historical events, even the most tragic ones, because we want to be able to see these events, understand how they occurred, and prevent them from occurring again. If you need to pause or you need to step out at any point, of course, that is okay. And additionally, the more we are able to come up with the language and the dialogue to learn about and talk about these difficult topics, the more prepared you will be for the rest of your life in engaging in challenging conversations. Okay, here we go. So, our first objective for today is I will be able to define nationalism and explain how the Japanese used it as an excuse, as a justification to invade China. So last year we learned about this concept of imperialism. I would write this down so you don't forget, and again, you can focus on just what I have bolded and underlined. Excuse me, imperialism is the takeover of a weaker, and I put weaker in quotations because the country wasn't actually weaker, but potentially they did not have the same level of technology in which to defend themselves by a stronger country through the use of military force or political influence. Military force, we understand. Political influence is a very strong government that's able to come in and set up or enforce their type of government on another country. Today, specifically, we're going to be looking at the use of military force. The justification used to conquer other countries that are not yours is typically under this idea of the stronger country is racially, economically, or politically superior. This is something we looked at last year under the umbrella of ideological imperialism. If you remember, I showed you some pretty racist cartoons last year that justified Europeans and Americans' imperialism or colonization in other countries, right? And an ideology, we know, is a set of beliefs and assumptions that guide behaviors. We learned this concept of white man's burden and the duty and obligation to civilize, quote unquote, the less civilized, barbarous people. We learned about the Belgians going into the Congo. They did so not just for ideological reasons, but also for economic. As we remember last year, we learned about all the resources that are in the Congo. Okay, so we have ideological motives, one country believing in their own superiority to another. There are other motives for going in, but today we're focusing on Japan going into China through the use of military force and their belief that they were superior in all areas to the Chinese people. They believed that they were superior both socially, economically, politically, and they used imperialism as a tool to dehumanize and to kill Chinese citizens. This was their justification for mass murder and abuse. So let's take a look at Japanese imperialism. I talked a little bit earlier on about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. As we see here, Manchuria is in northern China. Some of the reasons why they wanted to imperialize is because at the end of the 19th century, so around the end of that, around the 1800s, Japan went through something known as the Meiji Restoration. During this time, they focused heavily on industrializing their military, building up their military complex, educating their people, specifically in Western countries, and also by completely redoing or reinstituting a new type of government. So part of this idea was that they were trying to improve their image on the world stage, but also make people very proud to live in Japan. So then we think about that idea of nationalism. And then we think back to Hitler and his idea of nationalism, and you'll see that the two are fairly similar. Japan, just like Germany, just like countries in the past, had a desire for raw materials. Where could they go to get materials in other countries that they didn't have for themselves? They also wanted to expand their living space for their growing population. And of course, expand their empire because more land, of course, we know, equals more power. So we can look here again, and I've shown you this map before. We can see how Japan slowly begins to take over different parts of Asia, starting before the war and continuing after the war. So let's take a look at the timeline. Okay, so before I start, I want to be clear that Japan wanted to create a Pacific empire, similar to what Germany wanted to do in Europe. Okay, so beginning with China, in the 1920s, China transitioned from more than 2,000 years of imperial rule into a new republic. This is actually when the Chinese Communist Party came to power. And as you can imagine, China is beginning to um, is beginning to is beginning to create their own country, and they want to establish their own form of independence. So, as you can imagine, the Japanese invade in 1931, they are enraged. So Japan comes in 1931 and invades Manchuria, which is considered northeast China. Um, and during this time, they were considering this a puppet state of Japan, meaning it was under the control of the Japanese government. We think back to imperialism, we think back to trying to establish your own political system in other countries. So, what's interesting is that the Japanese military was behaving pretty autonomously, meaning they were able to do what they wanted without consulting the government. There was something known as the elder statesman, And the elder statesmen were these men who came to power after the Meiji Restoration, and they were the ones in charge. However, they had passed away, so now the military was able to do as it pleased. There was, however, an emperor, Emperor Hirohito, who I will speak about later, and he actually never objected to this invasion of Manchuria. It was previously called Manchukuo, and I apologize because I am positive I mispronounced that. He never objected to this invasion. In fact, he never even referred to it as an invasion. He just referred to it as an incident. He actually, if you could take a look at the map, was more concerned about the Soviets invading China, that's the USSR, than he was about Japan going into China. Then we have 1936, where Japan signs an alliance with Germany. And they're able to say, okay, Germany, you do you in Europe, and we're going to do what we want to do in Greater East Asia. This was all, they all had their own self interest in mind. And then in 1937, it was the beginning of the Second Sino Japanese War. This was the war between the Japanese and the Chinese, um, in which the Japanese refer to it as the War of Resistance because the Chinese people fought back. Um, Japan, however, is able to conquer Beijing, which then, of course, leads to what we'll be studying today, which is the rape of Nanking. So, in 1920s, I'm going to pause it just for 1 second. Okay, so I already spoke a little bit about what happened in the 1920s and then the 1937 when Japan conquered different parts of China, including Shanghai and Beijing, and marched to Nanking. Nanking is just south. In 1937, Nanking fell, and the Japanese soldiers unleashed an immense amount of destruction, burning, robbery, mass murder, and what we would now refer to today as genocide. What's interesting is that when Japan launched a full invasion of China, there were massive amounts of casualties. 250,000 Chinese troops were killed. Japan, in unto itself, lost 30% of its army because many of the men who were fighting in this were actually older and ill prepared to fight. And Nanking was also a symbolic victory obviously in quotations, for the Japanese because they wanted to deliver the message to the Chinese people that they could not go on being this independent nation. And again, it had only been about 16 or so years that the Chinese had been independent. They had been previously been under the influence of other Western powers. And they said, you will not, the Japanese wanted to make it clear that the Chinese would not be independent and they would be part of what was known as a Pan-Asian Japanese empire. Excuse me. So what I would like you to do now is I would like you to pause this and open up the video I've linked on Canvas. And I would like you to answer these 3 questions. Don't worry if you don't get them all. I will go over the answers in the next slides. Okay, now that you've watched the movie and answered the questions, I want to go over the answers together, or whatever together looks like in this space. Please add on anything that you did not get. So why did Japan want to conquer Nanking? Now again, let's pretend I'm calling on you. You see me in front of the classroom. Okay, great answers. Awesome. Here we go. Nanking was China's capital. Okay, so I had said earlier in the slides that conquering Nanking was of strategic importance. Here's why. Nanking was China's capital, and it held great political and cultural value to the Chinese. It was a sense of rebirth in China, and it also showed their own sense of pride or nationalistic feelings in their new Chinese government. Okay, again, this was a message that the Japanese wanted to send to say, you will not be an independent nation. Question number 2. Why were the Japanese soldiers so tired and frustrated as they prepared to invade Nanking? Well, the Chinese did not just welcome them in and allow them to come in. They were strong, as we talked about a little bit in the Do Now, and they resisted. And in fact, the Japanese were surprised by the strength of the Chinese armies along the coast. They were expecting it to be quick, but they were very surprised by the intensity of the battles. And again, as I said previously, the soldiers were worn down, they were a bit older, and they had previously lived in poverty. They weren't these young, strapping, well off men. They were not in great shape themselves. This was not Japan's finest and most fit soldiers. There was also a sense of anger and just pure exhaustion, feeling like their dignities and their rights as soldiers had been violated due to the strength of the Chinese resistance. And this continues. So this anger, this frustration, this justification that what they were doing to spread their culture, to spread their ideas, to spread their military prowess. They believed that that was their quote unquote right. And they were frustrated that they couldn't exercise or couldn't carry out what they believed to be their right or their duty, which then, of course, further triggered the behavior to come. Why did Japanese soldiers feel they had free rein to commit atrocities against the Chinese civilians? Japanese commanders did not make any orders that soldiers should try to keep the capital intact or treat civilians humanely, meaning there was no indication, no orders to be kind or to not enact incredible amounts of violence. As a result, the Japanese felt they had free rein to capture Nanking and use whatever means necessary. And we could think about just for a second, going back to Golding Trial, it's like, do we think that these men who were fighting, and yes, they were all men, were born violent and then they were just, when they were allowed to exercise this violence, they did so? Or do you think it's because that they were trained into believing in these ideas of superiority that they then went on to exercise such atrocities? Interesting to think about. So the lead general, who was in charge of defense in China, ends up leaving his post. He had to abandon it, and now the Chinese are completely on their own. And again, I've already spoken about this, but the ingrained hatred of the Chinese further strengthened the feeling of the Japanese soldiers that their rights to invade had been violated and that they had to carry on this duty. We can see here, this is an image of a Japanese newspaper. The title here says, "Incredible Record. Both second lieutenants go into extra innings. The contest to cut down 100 people." What does this sound like to you? To me, this sounds like a baseball game. This sounds like something that people are bragging about. Going into extra innings, comparing killing to baseball. It's pretty brutal. So I would like you to be doing this in partners. I forgot to mention that at the beginning, but I did put that in the notes. So I'd love you to just pause for a second, talk to each other, think about what is nationalism and how might nationalism or how might the Japanese have used nationalism to invade their to justify to justify their invasion of China. So turn and talk with each other, just casually, don't need to write anything down. Okay, so let's take a look in the last couple slides. So this was something that I was curious to learn more about and did a bit more research because I wanted to know about this idea of Japanese beliefs about surrendering. And here's what I've learned. And my knowledge is not exhaustive, and I'm open to students who know more about this or who want to share it with me, letting me know. Because this has always been something that I have found that students have found pretty interesting. So to the Japanese, surrender was this unthinkable act of cowardice. And it was this ultimate violation of military honor. This is something that was drilled into them from childhood onward. So I want to pause for a minute. I spoke earlier about the Meiji Restoration, but one of the things I wanted to note about the Meiji Restoration was the role of the emperor. Prior to the Meiji Restoration, the emperor was sort of this shadowy figure, kind of like how some people might describe the Queen of England or the Pope. They didn't have a ton of authority but they were there. They were of importance. However, after the Meiji Restoration, so the beginning of the 20th century, when Japan is starting to exert its dominance, when it's starting to have more and more nationalistic feelings, building up its army, educating its people, trying to make sure the West does not invade, the emperor becomes the ultimate authority and the highest form of patriotism. Well, what does that mean? People weren't allowed to look at him, they weren't allowed to speak to the emperor. He had been promoted to this entirely new level. And we think about the role of indoctrination in Japan, just like we looked at it in North Korea, just like we looked at it briefly in Germany. Children were taught at a young age that the emperor, that the country of Japan was the most important, was the most superior to all other countries. Okay? And one of the reasons why they learned this is because Japan watched its neighbors in Asia be controlled by Western powers, specifically in Europe, specifically European countries, but also a bit of the Americans as well. And they did not want that to happen. So they are drilling into their young kids the importance of honoring the country of Japan. And therefore, they use that nationalism, that pride in Japan, to look down upon other people. We think about that ideological imperialism, specifically prisoners of war in China, looking at them as they are utterly unworthy of human life. And I think for a lot of people, this is like, wow, this is pretty intense. But this is not uncommon, right? A lot of militaries around the world, the United States included, but there are a lot of militaries that fight in the name of their flag, fight in the name of the American flag, fight in the name of their government or in the name of their religion, right? This is not an uncommon sentiment that is unleashed during war or prior to war at this point. Okay, so extreme acts of violence seen as patriotic. So, again, I spoke a little bit about this and I spoke a little bit about the indoctrination that happens at a young age. What I think is also interesting is that, and you're going to hear from people who survived the rape of Nanking, and you're going to hear a little bit more about these extreme acts of violence. And you're going to hear a little bit more about the brutal killing. What I find to be so interesting is that people in Europe and the United States thought it was too fantastical. They couldn't even believe what they were reading in their own newspapers. They couldn't believe it was happening. And to be perfectly honest, they were far more concerned with what was happening in Europe under Hitler than they were what was happening in Asia. However, there are a group of Westerners, Americans included, and some Europeans who set up what was known as the safety zone. And you're going to read about those people tomorrow and their incredible strength and their incredible acts of courage were truly phenomenal and helped save thousands of Chinese people's lives. So we're going to look a little bit at the impact on the Chinese civilians. I would like you to read this quote on your own. I do not want to read it out loud, but I do want you to understand just the extent of the brutality that occurred. You may need to pause this. In 6 weeks, over 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were murdered in Nanking. These 6 weeks of carnage that started in 1937, 2 years before World War II even started, represented the single worst atrocity during the World War II era in either the European or Pacific theaters of war. So what we're going to do now is you and your partner are going to go into modules under Monday, and I have 2 different testimonies in there. Please choose different ones. If you have time, you can listen to both, but my guess is you won't. Each partner listens to a different one, responds to these 3 questions in your notebook. If you need to see these slides on your own, they're of course linked on modules. Okay? You're going to listen to these and you're going to answer these questions. And I really want you to think about what you learned last week about primary sources and the value of primary sources and how it makes you really understand the atrocities. Sometimes when we learn things in history, even I have a hard time believing that such terrible things happen. But when you hear it firsthand from the people who experienced it, it's pretty moving. And then I want you to think back to this idea of strength that we spoke about in the Do Now and connect it to these people's stories. When both partners are done, and I hope you have time for this, but I'm not sure if you will. And if you don't, I'll leave time for it tomorrow. I would like you to share your responses with your partner. The older partner goes first by answering question number one. The younger partner will listen actively, and then the younger partner will repeat back what the older partner said, and then using those sentence frames. I'm hearing you say da 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 da, and this is interesting because I had something similar da 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 da. Question two, younger partner starts this time, same protocol. Question number three, you can discuss it as normal, no protocol. Thank you all. Thank you for listening, and I really do miss you guys. I hope to be back tomorrow. Fingers crossed. Talk to you later.